Right, well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our Louth County Library Service Decade of Centenaries series of lectures. Tonight we're joined by Dr. Colm Gearailt for his lecture on Teaching the Nation's Past, Irish History in Secondary Schools. Colm is a lecturer in the Marino Institute of Education and Hibernia College, and he is also the writer in residence for On T-shirt in Dingle. So, Colm, if you want to start us off there.
Perfect. So fáil to Steach na Haine. So Mr. Colm Gearailt, and I suppose I'm going to share my screen now and pull up our PowerPoint, and then away we go. So, let's do the curly show. Marvis Rostock, Bargon just lame to Steach. And here he goes. What we teach shows what we value. The image of the society wishes to project of itself, and the image we create for others can be associated with the history learned in school. In 1973, the Irish Times published an article by Maeve Binchy on her former experience as a history teacher in Ireland, where she noted, quote, the fearsome responsibility which her post entailed, and the danger that teachers tended to quote, pass on your own prejudices, attitudes, and even misconceptions to people who are in no position to argue with you. Unlike historians or even undergraduates in university, secondary school students, quote, haven't read the latest research. They don't subscribe to history today. Their only comeback is what you said last week or what the textbook says, unquote. And this position of innocence and vulnerability is all the more alarming if one viewed the history teacher, as Binchy did, as, quote, the last link between a child and his or her idea about our past and culture. Nish rudí eile chuirnisteach é núlacht idir agus ó héh meon stare, Forbert stare, rudí an nás dalamh, star publi, scanán, chlár fascinatia. You know, there's more things that influence your understanding of history than just the classroom. But I believe that Binchy's analysis captures an essential truth of history in secondary schools. And its awareness was among the driving forces behind this research that I'm going to discuss today. So I know there's so many type of topics that we could talk about for when we're looking at something like teaching Irish history in schools. So obviously I'm going to have to omit some due to time constraints. But today, how am I going to Yinov? Gurbe on Madela star skiel star na Hearn. Gur rud a bhí á Corcan Cína chuig an am ná gur áidir díú na firmhóra is star na tíide. I want to argue that the narrative of Irish history was promoting this traditional great man approach to history with a strong emphasis on high politics and on religion. This narrative, though, and this is very important to realize, is not as simplistic nor as xenophobic as previously assumed. Níon an star agus díreach á bhí na sasna go hainis, tá sé níos casta ná sin. And to establish this, we'll look today at the teaching of Irish history in Irish secondary schools post-independence from a number of perspectives. We'll look at the versions of the past set for study, that those taught in schools and those learned by students in the Irish Free State and beyond. This study examines the curriculum set by the department, how this developed over time, alongside the political, contextual and ideological forces that shaped these developments during this period. The ways in which the curriculum was engaged with is also highlighted, making this a study not only of politics, state building and ideology, but a study in publication, examination and education also. On continue Steach leis na textlautha, on the textbooks. I'm going to focus in on these as well as the certificate exams and their importance to guiding history education. So this paper then analyzes issues of policy versus practice, moving beyond history as officially accepted and onto it as a subject in and of itself in schools of all denominations. It highlights the official rhetoric as to Irish history's purpose and importance before considering this against the classroom realities and the constrained context in which teacher occurred. So she'll not cross a raw habra and even known the kind of gachrod akshokatamajidu staker enough. I look specifically at secondary school history for a number of reasons. And principally among these is accepted in government records from the time. It wasn't until post-primary level that history as a complex subject was dealt with in any serious form, beyond the simple ballads and mythologies previously taught to kids. As the Minister for Education, Eoin McNeill, declared, quote, The teaching of Irish history is still more important in the secondary school, for the general principle holds good that the higher the form of education, the greater its influence on the national well-being. So, tegum gur nach onan nadina chuig kun na manscoile agus on phobal fad. We forvorn nadina dul chuig na bunskoile. Most students were ending their education at primary school level, but it is for these reasons that I wanted to focus on secondary education, as well as the fact that those educated in these schools, though fewer in numbers, would progress to form part of the social, professional, and political elites. What version of their nation's past they were taught in schools and how is then important. Overall, today's talk considers how the Irish government and those in positions of power in education frame the national narrative once given the opportunity, and the means through which this was done. It tracks history as a subject, and specifically Irish history within this, from 1924, when the Department of Education was first founded, until 1969, when a new era of history teaching emerged. How Irish history was taught played a pivotal role in framing cultural memory and consolidating national identities in the wake of independence and beyond. Moreover, in this decade of centenaries, when history has so often been to the forefront of national politics, as well as public discourse, an examination of how the Irish past was taught in the wake of independence is not only relevant, but culturally significant as well. Now, Agathus, Bavalum Chornu, Goilm Fichent such a moone star na heren. Dun good small on darker ifigul. So I'm going to look at it more so from the official perspective. As it was outlined in the curriculum, as evaluated in the certificate exams, and as portrayed in the popular textbooks of the time. And also as discussed by the teachers themselves, as seen through the union files, predominantly those of the SDI. Ní chiallaíonn sa gur unan an rud a chun play nuv agus an scéal an umlan. Today's talk won't be completely representative of people's individual memories as well as other factors. And so, like, I'm sure there's people in the crowd right now who will have their own twists on the tale that I'm going to tell today, which might differ from my own work. And for that reason, I would never want to delegitimize the experience or memories that you have. And when we're in questions at the end, I'd love to hear from people afterwards if they have particular stories which they'd like to share with, which might contrast or maybe support what we discussed today. But to begin, the widely held conception of history teaching in the first half century of the state is one that fits into educationalist John O'Donoghue's argument that, quote, for too long history is not a subject but a creed, not a discipline but a weapon. Kagan Lacter Lish. Grev Shisha Lornoch is a policy Gaelu in Nas Blachas. So while it was accepted that it was central to this, was the teaching of Irish history simply a way of promoting a pro-nationalist, anti-English perspective among students? Or was it simply another subject on the curriculum? Nish Hashe Rajak or Fader Tishkin to all on Schlieg of Willon Sucky Id Hain a Churkin Keen. It's been told we can tell how the society wants to depict itself by analysing what is set for study in a history programme. And so Hashile Feshkind Leshavarso, John O'Donoghue or John O'Callaghan in a lower Council the Tain Lower Hashkita face star Moon Star in the Hair, one of the only ones that deal specifically with the teaching of Irish history. It was said in this book that the purpose of school history was directly political, to create loyal subjects to the new state and to justify and preserve the new state's existence. If education as a whole, as argued elsewhere, is geared towards maintaining the dominant social cultures of a nation, then history was seen as a way through which loyalty to that nation could be maintained. This would also fit into Marc Ferraud's belief in this work here, where he theorized the intrinsically political use of history in nation-state building, of school history, excuse me. According to Ferraud, societies use school history to condition the minds of the citizens. Control of the past means mastery of the present. The dominant societal powers, be they state, church, political party, or private interest, he argued, are concerned, quote, to censor the vision of the past in order to inculcate their values with the goal of consolidating their position. Because a stocha Gurhin show Nachmar and also the Vacrotic George Orwell in the idea Hochto Cahard, this contention that, quote, who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. And this was seemingly being furthered through Ferrot's understanding of school history in the different contexts which he assessed. In the Irish context, by promoting Irish history for the very first time, the new state could be seen to be justifying its existence. The degree to which the Irish example cohered with Ferrot's appraisal of censorship is a different matter, however, especially considering how the major parties post-independence, they all originated from the same political movement. You don't see this huge left-right divide in Ireland as you would see in other European nations of the time. The setting of a full outline course in Irish history in its own right in 1924, with the exclusion of British and imperial history, has been seen by one historian as being, quote, in full accord with the state policy of employing education and history within it to create an Irish Ireland. Irish history was, the most important subject after the Irish language to this policy of Gaelicization, policy Gael-Uso, as we see in this slide, and being not only complementary to Irish, but integral to the possible success of reviving the language. Agus, if you show Ráte ag Owen McNeill Marhumpla in Naig Sahendiag, Dorche, quote, the history of Ireland, at least generally felt, is almost a necessary adjunct to the learning of Irish. And I think the ignorance of Irish history is the chief cause of want of interest in the Irish language. To anyone who had not a feeling of Irish history, the learning of Irish is mere philology. Agus, Nasa stuck a grif sin nach mar Esham Lord the Milne and Unsairstock nor Horn Mac. This kind of represented that official view in the Free State, where you see similar declarations regularly repeated in their records, and specifically with regard to Irish education. In 1932, Turlough O'Rafferty, secondary school inspector and later secretary for the Department of Education, stated in the Dundalk Examiner for County Louth here today, he stated that, quote, history is almost as important as the Irish language itself. History is one of the cornerstones of nationality. And the interplay between history and the Irish language for distinctly nationalist purposes was also furthered in the rhetoric surrounding the textbooks to be used in the secondary school as well. And we'll get to that later as well. Cultural nationalist aspirations were not the only driving ideologies behind secondary school history, however, or at least the idea that people had of what school history was supposed to be about. History was significantly seen from a religious standpoint as well, with the inculcation of Christian morality being stressed. And I suppose the most influential proponent of such a claim was Reverend Timothy J. Corcoran. Alongside his calls for a wider perspective with regards to the content of history in secondary schools, Corcoran notably argued that, quote, the teaching of history in the new secondary school, curriculum should embody a Catholic spirit with a Catholic outlook. He called for all Catholic schools to provide a course in history, quote, wherein the church will have its fullest place as the directing force in all civilizations in progress. History was to be considered from a moral perspective in order to create upstanding members of a Catholic society. Agus chuig stuck on bheon so but bheon coitianta é seo ag an nám. Agus bhí sé seo ag annach daoine sa sucky ag an nám. It fitted with this wider societal context, which, as the influential historian J.H. White argued, this society retained a remarkable consensus in the years 1923 to 37, a time when there was, quote, overwhelming agreement that traditional Catholic values should be maintained, if necessary, by legislation. As Minister for Education J.M. O'Sullivan noted in 1931, grev an Éireann mar hir, grev course Masha that, quote, that this system satisfies the legitimate demands of the church and state. Anything that would tend even to shake a system of that kind, I would consider disastrous in the extreme. Corcoran called for national history to be the main focus of school history. He further maintained that, quote, the teaching of history must, in Irish Catholic schools, be frankly and fully Catholic. History, as a subject, was seen as central to the religious ethos maintained in the majority of Irish secondary schools, being seen as morally beneficial. And its mandatory position in the curriculum was deemed necessary for this reason, as part of the wider social project to preserve Irish culture and its traditional principles from the threat of secular modernization. This fear that Ireland would be too influenced by the continent, by England, by America, that there was something to uphold, and school history was seen as a way, as one of the tools to be used for this purpose. And this final point suggests that the inherently moral position of the history course was as much a product of who controlled the schools as of the formal curriculum. Both Protestant and Catholic schools were to be taught the same basic material for the central examination. As an analysis of the syllabus demonstrates, religion was not the sole focus of the course. Moreover, while the promotion of certain cultural aspirations from a nationalist perspective may have been expected, especially if we view the Free State as a post-colonial society, the curriculum was not simply a vehicle of religious interest. And the analysis of the certificate exam questions further demonstrates this, and we'll get to that later. Now, having established the dominant value system driving education in general and history in particular over the last few minutes, it's important to look at what was being taught. Syllabus Hain. What is the content of the syllabi in operation between 1924 and 69, as well as the context surrounding their creation? The new state offered the opportunity to redesign the programs for study, in contrast to those in place under the pre-independence Board of Education. Now, this was coupled with the centrality of Catholicism to the majority of secondary schools. It was to this end that Corcoran demanded a shift not only of content and an increased focus on Irish history, but also in pedagogy and purpose. As noted in 1923, quote, "What is needed is a radical reconsideration of the whole substance and matter of history for effective use in general education. The use of wide liberty of choice in such matter by schools and teachers, and the development of methods of teaching which will be both intellectually and morally more effective than those at present applied in Ireland." Now, whether this actually emerged is a whole other question. But this is what he was promoting. This is what they were looking for. This is what was guiding the changes at the time. And following the establishment of the new Department of Education, the first official syllabus in Irish history was published in 1924. This new program comprised 2 exam levels, intermediate and leaving, as opposed to the 3 in place beforehand. At intermediate certificate level, the course, section A, was defined as being a study of, quote, "the general outline of Irish history and of the historical relations of Ireland with Great Britain, the continent of Europe, America, and Australia." It was also acknowledged that the certificate examinations which emerged from the syllabus would be, quote, "of the most general type and test the knowledge of, quote, the general causes and effects of the greater movements of Irish history." But that's it. That was the syllabus over 3 lines. That's everything that was supposed to be taught over the space of 4 years. Leaving certificate was simply defined as a more detailed understanding of the intermediate certificate. So it's vague enough. From 1937 till 41, the study of Irish history was to range, quote, from pre-Christian Ireland to the Sinn Féin movement and resurgence of 1916, with pre-1014 to be tested through inspection. That's what you see here. When analysed, these topics promoted a linear chronology of Irish history, which focused primarily on the military and political events deemed integral to the story of Ireland. Tensions emerged in 1941 when attempts were made to introduce more modern Irish history to the course for leaving certificate. Only a few months after this being set initially, after setting the course, which now went range as far as 1921, was backtracked without warning. The grand unifying narrative of the 1916 Rising was stressed over the Irish War of Independence, while the origins and activities of World War I were removed entirely from the study of European history. This should be looked at in the context of the time. Europe was in the middle of the Second World War. Ireland had declared neutrality. It would appear that the policymakers wished to avoid any charges of taking sides through what was to be taught in the schools, removing any reference to modern periods which could be contentious in Europe, and also perhaps more tellingly, and in the light of the Civil War legacy in Ireland, which might elicit extreme responses from teachers and parents alike. So, Saulig, Mohammed ag muine suas cofada le cogan na sirsha, vak muintori lehera, wa kiafonak muinimid cogan na garret. There was this danger of bringing very real politics into what was being taught, because you can set a syllabus, but you can't control the teachers too much as well. The teachers have autonomy in their own classroom, and if you put the syllabus up to 1921, there is a danger that 1922 and 23 gets included as an aftermath, and then you'd have tension between so parents, school, teachers, and on. But this decision as to how the curriculum is structured is always deliberate, as there is more to teach than time allows. And the periodization of study is a sensitive issue, with the question as to what aspects of the past should be dealt with, and particularly how far should historical study encroach on recent violent events, being crucial to an understanding of the role that history was to play in education. And this is notably been discussed by Alan McCulley in the north, so in the context of Northern Ireland. And this issue of avoidance was not exclusive to secondary Irish history, though. It was prevalent in the wider cultural sphere. In terms of Irish literature, it's been noted by Philip O'Leary, for example, in his book on Gaelic prose in the Free State, where he said, on the whole, quote, it seems that most Gaelic writers, like the authors of the textbooks, preferred to remain silent on the Civil War. Nor is it any wonder that Micheál Branach, as he had school inspector and Ungum translator, wrote in his 1966 autobiography, quote, I do not intend to discuss the harm the Civil War did, nor the evil consequences it left behind. I would rather draw a big black curtain down on that period and put it out of my memory altogether if I could. This exact omission was emphasized within the recommendations to include more modern Irish history when the syllabus was revamped, or a new syllabus came in 1969. As noted in the 1966 report of the governmental study group tasked with devising this new course, they said, quote, by drawing a curtain over the events of 1916 to 21 and over the subsequent tragic Civil War and its aftermath, we certainly avoid the risk of raising delicate subject matter and interpretations of history which to so many adults may seem tendentious. On the other hand, it is suppressing a knowledge of the most important period in the formation of modern Ireland if we neglect the history of the past 4 decades. So there's an awareness that this period has been removed from study for the previous 20 years. And now when they were trying to redo the syllabus, there was a whole discussion of, well, should we bring history up to date? But for students of Irish history, this black curtain of avoidance, to coin a phrase, was not so much a desire, but a reality of their school courses. That the 1941 syllabus was altered within 3 months of the course being set confirmed that this black curtain was indeed in operation in terms of the history curriculum. No alteration occurred in the history curriculum between 1943 and 1969. Throughout the period, the Irish history syllabus was outlined along the chronological principle from the, quote, earliest times until independence. And this mirrored structures seen elsewhere. I bring this up so that we don't get into this habit of thinking, of looking at, an Irish exceptionality. Tá rudí tarlú in air and tarlú idir elle. Agus socha sin just on meon Gearailt feast and the dachas again. This has been discussed in terms of this, chronological principle by academics across the world. John Fiennes, when discussing history classrooms in England, criticized calls for, quote, breadth of knowledge as it resulted in, quote, an attempt to swallow all of it, however superficially treated, so that students should do ancient, then medieval, and then modern. Such a curriculum was criticized for resulting in infinite harm being done to history teaching in school. Quote, it turned history into a race which nobody could ever win, with the teacher getting faster and faster the nearer the exam they got, leaving out greater and greater chunks of reality in the hopes of making it to the winning post. This, it was stated, quote, paints history not as it is, confused and confusing, bedraggled and messy, and sorts it out into one almighty washing line, that is, in a neat and linear story. So, Inish agus sin stochachéis na príomh in the bunfuintí ó haven on syllabus a curriculum a churnu. Tuigim nach an son agus an scíal an umlán. Agus chun tuiscint cearta áil an curriculum an múin na starre caimid fiochant na takes leabhar leis. You can't understand the teaching of history without a study of the textbooks. So that's where we'll go now, if that's all right. The issue of school textbooks has been and continues to be a point of contention both in Ireland and abroad. In the Irish context, it was widely acknowledged that history teaching was heavily dependent on the use of textbooks. Moreover, school children do, and especially during this period did not tend to question the accounts presented to them in their textbooks, even more so than considering how critical thinking isn't a part of any history teaching at the time. Kids when they're 13, 14, don't look at the textbook as as lagging than scíal, that it's a one particular version. No, it's almost like the history Bible. They're not, I suppose, or especially at this time, we're not being taught to view it in this manner. This was the word of God, and you read what's in your book. And this consequently leads, as argued by Belgian historian Bert van Heij, to a situation whereby the historical narrative of history textbooks seems to present its readers with an untouchable, objective, and absolute truth. And this section now considers what this absolute truth consisted of in the various textual accounts of Irish history. And it focuses on the most popular textbooks used in Irish secondary schools between 1921 and 1969. And these are this text: Short History of the Irish People by Mary Hayden and George Moonan, Star Cheannachas Éireann le Micheál Ó Siochrú, Tá Stocha Nakinis Mo na Class Book of Irish History le James Carty, agus Laura Ella and Son Egg on Tahir James Ryan, or John Ryan, Gamskiel. So John Ryan's History of Ireland, Volume 1 and 2, as we said, James Carthy's class books, I suppose, and the more advanced Hayden and Moonan. We have the Short History of the Irish People, we have Micheál Ó Siochrú, Star Cheannachas Éireann, and finally, and this, I suppose, this was the most important for the Protestant schools at the time, was Dora Castley's History of Ireland 1 and 2. And these 5 works comprise the school textbooks used in the majority of secondary schools until the introduction of the influential Gill and Macmillan series in 1960. In terms of analysing the content of these books, to understand the narrative that is being propounded in a history textbook, it's crucial to examine the emphasis placed upon specific events, personalities, and periods in the past. On bhéim ábhar le, daoine le, agus tréimhsí le. By cross-comparing the indexes of the respective textbooks, it's possible to see what elements of Irish history were stressed continually. Comailesin, it also highlights the noticeable differences in terms of the weighting different authors gave to specific aspects of Irish history. These, I'm arguing, reflect the different political beliefs and contextual considerations of each writer. It's important to note how the levels of sophistication varied across the textbooks, with some being more abridged and simplified owing to their intended audience. But go bunúsa go rud Hamadian van son ná, má tá leabhar a bháin ann as caitheann sé fithe leathanach ag dailá le 7:08 as chiad leathanach, chun tú ránis gur ionlansin agus fithe fan giad an leabhar. Ach dámach leabhar eile agus níos sé agat túir leathanach a bháin as chiad. Níos ní ionlansin agus, ein fan giad an leabhar. So if one person is putting way more, just providing more pages for specific topics, according to the ratio of the book, they're demonstrating that the author views this topic to be of more importance to the overall scheme. And so by examining the extent to which certain events or personalities are engaged with in proportion to the overall work, it's possible to understand what aspects of Irish history were dealt with in more or less depth in line with issues of emplotment. From this, the areas most emphasized can be systematically established. And in terms of findings, the textbooks were remarkably similar to one another in terms of the general narrative and content structure. So I'll explain this in a bit, but basically what you see is on the left-hand side, it goes, what is the consistency of topic engagement? So how much of each book discusses things that are discussed in every other book as well. And I suppose then what we can do then is we get to see, right, we have a consistency of general story of the actual topics themselves, but that next we can talk about, well, how much of the book engages with these topics, with these topics that are shared across all the books. Now we can look at, well, what are the emphasis that's placed within the books on these individual topics. Over 3/4 of Hayden and Moonan's, for example, discuss matters also discussed in all the other works. Ryan post 1960 included, or 1600 excluded. In total, the textbooks maintained a high level of consistency in terms of the content addressed, as underlined in the comparison of subject content in Table 1, as we see here. Overall, and as shall be further discussed, a general narrative of Irish history was maintained across each of the textbooks, which tended to focus on a traditional great man approach to history with a strong emphasis on high politics. A wide range of choices were offered within that tradition. And to this end, the narrative expressed in these texts were not necessarily oppressive or rigid, as there was no single consensus view of what aspects of Irish history were most important. So if we take just, say, 2 of these textbooks, for example, those of Hayden and Ó Siochrú, this divergence is plainly evident. And this is what I was trying to say. Even though they discuss the same type of topics, Ó Siochrú has way more of an emphasis on the land league, on the the Parnell struggle for land, as opposed to if you look at Hayden and Moonan, there's there's more focus on constitutional politics, but also on the big moments. The different emphases which were placed on various events and figures in Irish history according to the political and class bias of the author. This can be seen when we actually look at the textbooks like this. While the textbooks were conventionally nationalist in their emphasis, this is important, they were not xenophobic or driven exclusively by religious fervour or anti-English sentiment. The faith and fatherland version of Irish history was more prevalent in the works of James Carty and Micheál Shukru than in the other works examined. These two were the most popular texts in English and Irish respectively, meaning though that this was the predominant version of Irish history transmitted in text to secondary students during this period. So Carty agus Shukru an dá leabhar is cotíanta, an dá leabhar stocha is náisiúnaí, is fiachfar le an náisiúnachas ach an rud a chéile sin ná gur bé sin an legan na scíal a curcaráig de favor na daltaí scoile sa tíre ach ní idir fad. Discussion of events and figures which differed from this narrative or which acted as a counterpoint was still possible though. That's my point. It's not as simple, bad Englishmen, good Irishmen throughout. You could have a discussion of sort of countering narratives. Mary Hayden's account notably differed in places due to its more detailed nature. However, the depiction in general of great men and events tended to promote a narrative grounded in a contemporary framing of Irish nationalism and a united identity and culture. Now, having outlined the most popular texts and their content, it's crucial to examine the background and perspective of the writers and establish their positionality. The earliest of the 5 textbook series was Hayden and Moonan. So my name Sheeran. Published in 1921 in the midst of the War of Independence, this textbook was co-written by Mary Hayden, a UCD professor of history, and George A. Moonan, barrister at law, later circuit church judge. Adopting a Catholic nationalist perspective, Hayden presents the story of the Irish Catholics while allowing some discussions of Protestant patriots and nationalists from the 18th century onwards, by focusing on moments of political and military conflict from the Tudor period until modern times. Her work was lauded for avoiding many of the weaknesses of previous nationalist historians, as well as in its treatment of religion. Hayden was involved in the Dáil Commission of 1921, which discussed, amongst other things, the future secondary school programs for history and geography. So not only did she co-author one of the pivotal texts then, but she was also involved in devising the course to which the textbooks would eventually cater to. So she's right in there. Thus, Hayden's politics and general perspective are hugely important when assessing Irish history in secondary schools during this period. Described as representing, quote, an orthodox state-sanctioned national narrative that would later be attacked by revisionist historians, Hayden and Moonan's work was part of the post-1922 consolidation period and was important for, quote, giving the new state a meaning and interpretation that was widely disseminated. It set the standard for textbooks in the Free State, differing from the, quote, scrappy textbooks which preceded it. It offered the most comprehensive general survey of Irish history for students at university and secondary level. And importantly, many of the textbooks which followed, notably Carthy's class books and Casserly's History of Ireland, tended to share many of the same structural traits and overall depictions, though written for a younger audience. Carthy's piece did differ in terms of its more explicit political leanings. However, as noted below, as I will note now in a moment. But as for Hayden's book, it was created initially for university students. And in its preface, the Short History of Ireland stated that, quote, while written from a frankly national standpoint, the authors have made every effort to attain accuracy and avoid prejudice. Events are dealt with as far as possible in the spirit and atmosphere of their times, but are judged by their final effect on the destinies of the nation, unquote. It aimed to show Ireland, or Ireland's history, not as a series of unconnected events, but as a sequence. Like its note in Irish literature, Irish history, as taught in secondary schools, was to be seen, quote, as the product not of an isolated age or period, but of successive generations from the remote past down to the present day. So it's telling the story of Ireland as opposed to stating that all these things happen to happen. It's connecting the various parts of Irish history together. which is problematic in its own sense in terms of not judging these events in the context of their own time. It usually has an endpoint in sight. But by far, the most popular textbooks in use in secondary schools from the beginning of the 1930s until the late 1960s were by James Carthy. Some people in the crowd might have used this themselves. I'd like to see if you have. But his class books, volume 1 and 4, were repeatedly stressed in contemporary newspapers as, quote, the best introduction to Irish history extant, and were invariably mentioned whenever secondary school history textbooks featured in any newspaper account up until the mid-1970s. Highlighting its ubiquity, a 1975 Irish Times article, for example, was able to lament, quote, the odd circumstance that most people in Ireland who had a secondary education were educated out of a particular book. The same article, however, considered them to be, quote, an astonishingly effective simplification. So by the mid-1970s, Carthy's textbook, though hugely popular previously, was now being challenged and rejected. Carthy, a librarian with the NLI, had previously been employed by Dáil Éireann in 1921 before being expelled for opposing the Anglo-Irish Treaty. A prominent journalist as well, Carthy featured regularly in the Irish Times and the Irish Press. Lauded at the time for a general sense of balance and care, his textbooks were immediately popular, with contemporary reviews declaring them, quote, an indispensable working tool for all those who teach the history of Ireland. Published in the same year as Ryan, the two were often discussed and compared together in contemporary accounts. Ryan's texts, though, were a bit more advanced, catering for secondary school market and university, whereas Carthy, as acknowledged in the books themselves, were aimed at both primary and secondary school students. Madel takes Laura Ella. Wider cultural and religious factors were hugely important when it came to popularity. Agus Ashashola Feshkin Akahara, Mihal Shukru, Star Kianakazairan, Kutsahensa Agus Dor Casserly, The History of Ireland from 1941. O'Shukru as it was a trained primary school teacher and professor of Coláiste Cuivine Preparatory School in Glasnevin. Later, he went on to become primary and from 1935 on, secondary school inspector with the Department of Education before becoming chief inspector in 1965, the same year that his textbook had a new edition published. He was also an important figure in the Irish language movement alongside his brother, famed Gaelic writer and philologist Pádraig O'Shukru, no an Seoach, mar fear aithne air. His textbook, Star Kianakazairan, though, was the first full textbook series as Gaelan, which dealt with the whole course of Irish history taught in secondary schools, from quote, the pagan era to the War of Independence. This was especially important in line with the growing number of Class A and Class B schools, which taught the general curriculum and history in particular through the medium of Irish. O'Shukru's work, therefore, proved not only popular, but important in providing for a substantial number of schools from the 1930s onwards to teach Irish history, through Irish. And there's evidence that it was used up as far as the 1980s. It was also the central text that was used in Christian Brothers schools at the time, who, as many might know, were the largest providers of education in the country. So this grants additional weight to O'Shukru's text in terms of its content and its audience. Mar is léir gref sé catianta gref cáir agus grúsáide go fear lehanna. Finally, following a number of complaints that the standard textbooks of Irish history were promoting an understanding of national identity which they disagreed with, the task of providing suitable textbooks to each member of the minority Protestant denominations was seemingly addressed in 1941 with Dora Casserly's History of Ireland. And this was published after receiving a prize of 100 guineas from the General Synod of the Church of Ireland. Casserly was the author of an extremely popular textbook. Originally published as one volume, it was reissued in 1943 by the Educational Company of Ireland in 2 parts. By 1947, it had sold over 26,000 copies and was used widely in Protestant schools, both primary and secondary. It's worth noting, however, that Casserly's overall account of Irish history differed little from the other text, apart from the greater emphasis on like parts of historical movements and events which were especially relevant to the Church of Ireland and Protestantism. This would then help explain this, I suppose, lack of difference will help explain why the General Synod later criticised aspects of her work despite themselves having funded it. And all of these texts shared many features, such as the definitive narrative of resistance and glorious failure. This was primarily identified through the concept of an Irish people, united under a common Gaelic culture, language, and especially from the 16th century onwards, religion and sense of nationalism, though not expressed in these explicit terms. Each of the textbook series cover Irish history from the earliest times until the present, bar Ryan. They first established who the Irish were outlining their developments as Gaelic adherents of Christianity. The protagonists, if you will, then are faced with the threat of invasion from the seafaring Norsemen and, more importantly, from the Normans after 1169, to which a response is necessary. Thus, the resistance narrative is developed and maintained due to the repeated losses sustained by the Irish to this foreign element. So that's kind of the story of Irish history that is maintained throughout these textbooks. The coming of the Normans was highlighted, especially by Hayden and Moonan, and in the structure of Carthy's class books, as a definitive moment, shaping the arc of Irish history to the present day. And this was done by portraying the conflict not as between rival clans, ethnicities, or nations, but between rival civilizations. The Normans, for example, were condemned by Moonan for attempting, quote, to force upon it, Gaelic Ireland, a system which was hostile to everything that is considered wise, just, and practical in these great matters of government, law, and ownership of lands. And the narrative of resistance was not solely grounded in the unity of the Irish people, however, nor was the concept of an Irish people promoted to specifically mean all of Gaelic stock. Enemies of Ireland could just as easily be of Irish descent, while champions could be of English descent. For example, the celebration of William Gladstone in the 19th century in these texts. A simple binary of bad English versus good Irish was not being promoted. What is common is that the figures chosen to be highlighted and celebrated were those who adhered to and furthered a nationalist cause, though not necessarily independence. While a firm nationalist, Hayden demonstrated a degree of sophistication in her analysis of individuals and events. While discussing the Williamite Wars, for example, and the Siege of Derry in particular, George Walker is described as, quote, a militant clergyman of remarkable courage and capacity. It was not exclusively Catholic national leaders, therefore, who were celebrated. The Protestants of Derry were also noted as being brave during the suffer, though the siege is noted as the Siege of Derry, not Londonderry in these texts. So it is still betraying Hayden's, her perspective on the matter. But while a balanced account was noticeable in historical detail, the overall perspective from which the textbook was written certainly favoured the Gaelic Catholic points of view. The heroes and villains of these works, as well as the general, quote, glorious failures and resistance narrative, could be identified most tellingly through the use of descriptive language when describing key moments, and which highlighted the implicit bias of the authors. Despite suffering repeated defeats, the actions of the Irish were nearly always qualified or promoted. The Irish fought bravely until forced to concede, or else betrayed by a traitor of sorts. In certain instances, military failures were promoted in these textbooks by stressing their cultural importance or symbolic value for later generations. Carthy, for example, stressed how the Fenian Rebellion, like the Repeal Movement and the Confederation of 48, seemed to end in failure. But it would be a mistake to think that the Fenians achieved nothing. They kept alive the spirit of nationality. Their courage, unselfishness, and patriotism were honoured by the people. So by observing the specific description of important events and players, the overall perspective and ideology from which the textbook authors were writing can be assessed. Agus a rud a high lefischken ná go bhfuil pátrún lefischken dá bhar. And this pattern emerges when the use of personalization and depiction are analysed across the text. Those figures who were on the side of the Irish were described in generally positive terms and given physical characteristics to match their feats, while those who were on the wrong side of this nationalist narrative, or those who were too preoccupied with internal rivalries and local squabblings to see the larger picture, were either described in negative terms or simply left undefined. So I'm going to move on now to exams. Textbooks define the perspective from which Irish history was taught, but it's the exams which stress which aspects of this history were most important from an official sense. What is set for examination each year points to what is officially being called for to be learned and hence to be valued. Ní an tíimse le starry le schiig fe seo Gabriel Doherty. A dúirt gur unan an syllabus a bhí an Ryan Dacus agus, quote, the most detailed expression of official attitudes regarding the significant elements of the nation's past. I don't agree that it is the most detailed expression. Instead, this paper would consider this syllabus to be a guide towards and in connection with the actual expression of the certificate examination. It's through the exams that the inspectorate representing the department were predominantly recognised as having authority. Through a comprehensive breakdown of every exam question asked about Irish history between 1926 and 69 and subsequent analysis, it has been possible to demonstrate that how not all the topics outlined on the syllabus should be seen as being of equal value. Certain areas were far more prevalent than others in terms of how often questions were asked in them, and consequently were more important to expressing official attitudes regarding Irish history. This study allows claims previously made about Irish history teaching to therefore be quantifiably measured. Moreover, in terms of source material, exam papers are a massively underused historical resource and a further lens through which to gauge the official ideology regarding the history of the Irish nation. As noted by Noel Kelly, a student at Mount Sion CBS in the 1960s, quote, "In the case of most subjects, anything that was dealt with in class, any related homework given, any associated study tips, and the conducting of regular short exams and longer ones at the end of each term were all geared towards the state exams. The certificate examinations were integral to the teaching of Irish history in the Irish post-primary context." The complaint that learning was being superseded in importance to passing the exam was repeatedly demonstrated. Both teachers and students, quote, based their patterns of work on the expectations of examiners, as highlighted by one educationist. He discussed the low, cute cunning of many students, gearing their answers both in terms of language adapted and content covered to what was expected in the exam paper. And as I said, this is in no way unique to the history classroom. As Corcoran commented in the early 1920s, quote, "Following the mechanical routine of England, the exam has imposed itself on Irish history from the humblest preliminary or preparatory test up to the most advanced university exam, and by long-established custom, teachers let examinations set bounds to their daily works." So an investigation into how the syllabus was examined is therefore of equal, if not more importance than the syllabus itself, being used as the official marker of a pupil's aptitude and awareness of Irish history. Now, as this slide shows, it might be a bit difficult to sense, but what emerged was that over this, say, 45 years, the Norman invasion of Ireland was the most dominant aspect of Irish history taught throughout the period of the study, or examined on, and its consistent presence on the intermediate exam, beyond basic structural reasons, points to an understanding whereby this event in history marked the break, the point where the English arrived and one narrative of Irish history ended and another began. And you see this, as I mentioned, in the textbooks as well. In terms of the most popular topics, Sean on Chuka Over Kestes Kotianta, the Screw Test American the Man Teste. The colours represent a different era, different eras of Irish history. But what they clearly show is that more recent Irish history, which is in blue, was generally omitted from popular consideration. So last month, Parnell, Neil Aindenil Sahid Kuiger Diag, so Kuikesh Diag, Marchid the Star, stuck online of no more recent history. Beyond the starting point of question one in general, a specific choice was still required as to what aspects will be set for examination. Moreover, as we can see from the most popular questions, the overall narrative which stressed land, foreign invasion, and native resistance to this foreign force, while prevalent, was not uniformly maintained throughout the period. Changing context meant that so it had an effect on what aspects of Irish history were being promoted at any given time. In the first decade and a half of the exams, it was actually a pre-Norman Christianity and Gaelic Ireland which received the most attention. Between 1941 and 48, the most popular topics were the Norman invasion, with 5 questions in 8 years. But this period saw a considerable increase, as in the 1941 to 48. During this period, you see an increase in the importance of the Land League to the exam, with 5 questions also being asked. The next most prevalent topics were the Plantations, 1641 Rebellion, the United Irishmen, and the 1798 Rebellion, all of which being asked 4 times in 8 years. Rud effector nor hento raig, Shokadahan Stadahati in Snakagas and Shaskadi, the Norman Invasion, 1641, the Williamite Wars, and the United Irishmen. The Land League and Fenians are not as important now from the 60s, or from the late or the early 50s onwards. Now there is something about the structure of the exam which made you answer specific, periods at a given time, but there's more at play though. Especially from 1940 onwards, where even though the exam becomes more structured, there's still a choice to be made by the examiners of what will be asked. But in terms of periodization, I'm not layering to show stuck on Ruther William kind fig Anna Himpli. Some topics are more important at given times. In the first 20 years of the new state, where Ireland is just trying to promote control of its own lands, its own government, questions on the plantations, you have 11 times. It is the second most popular topic. But then once the exam becomes more structured, from 1940 onwards, you see this question falls by the wayside. And it's just kind of, I suppose, the best example, though, in terms of how context increased popularity are the Confederacy Wars, or the Confederate Wars of the 1640s. And I won't spend too long on this because I know that we're coming up to time. But what you see, though, with the Confederate Wars is that while it was always seen as popular, it was the second most popular question. It was not uniformly popular. From 1926 to 37, when the exam was only broadly defined, it only received 3 mentions out of a possible 96 questions. So it's not at all seen as important in that first 20 years. Ac leis an structúr níos daingine ó nairi tucha seachta raig, níos fi viidir á cheistú na uairs na hen cheir bliana. By 1949 onwards, the number of questions had increased to being asked 13 out of 20 years from, say, 49 to 69. So again, we see in that later period, 1641 becomes much more popular, and there must be a reason behind this as well. It's not a chance. So I'm going to skip ahead here a bit. But as noted earlier, through the exams, a sense can be gotten not only of what was being taught in the classroom, but also what elements of Irish history were officially being pointed to as significant. As Ferraud argues, the history that is taught in schools, quote, pinpoints the problems of its own times more fully even than those of the era which is supposed to be concerned. The newfound significance placed on the Confederation after 1948 could therefore be seen as an attempt to instill in the minds of the young the historical precedence of such an action, being promoted as an episode of Irish history which resonated with the present. The Confederacy was stressed, the Confederation of Kilkenny, that is, as the only post-Norman invasion period in Irish history where Ireland operated as a self-governing unit with a national reach. And the fact that this is being stressed from 1949 onwards is relevant, is historically important. What's more, the nature of the questions that were asked would support this line of argumentation, as questions were not so much based around the overall war, nor the rising of 1641, as the topic was actually outlined in the syllabus, nor even on Cromwell. The questions were outlined according to the operation of the Confederation and the reasons for initial success and ultimate downfall. So again, this promotion of Ireland, so it's Gaelic Ireland operating its own autonomy on the island. So I'm going to skip ahead for if that's all right, excuse me. But what you do see, though, when it comes to Leaving Cert, sometimes questions could become, I suppose, more nuanced. You do see in 1931 some questions which differed from this general narrative. There was a stress on the importance of land, but I suppose overall what's important is that when this understanding of Irish history as a Gaelic Celtic history is connected with the earlier stressing on pre-Norman Christianity, along with the importance of land, a trend can be seen to emerge. And this reflected the ethos of the fledgling state, which is generally accepted to have positioned itself as Gaelic, Catholic and agrarian. The spread of topics when exam questions are analysed by theme also highlight a number of additional salient points. To begin with, the physical force tradition by far trumps the constitutional national tradition by a margin of roughly 3-1 in terms of question topics. Even the issue, though, of like a separate Irish identity linked to a Gaelic national tradition, that's so often seen as the cornerstone of Irish history education, this was less prominently featured than the actual military endeavours in the syllabus. Militarism and the continual struggle between the indigenous people and a foreign power was more important than what this indigenous identity actually entailed. It should be noted that this focus on the physical force should be seen in the educational context of the time, agus an tuiscin to cada chéal stad eganam, especially school history. What did it mean? The great man approach, coupled with political and military history, and the memorization by students of these facts about great men and political events, constituted a dominant tradition of how history was taught up until the 1960s, and was specifically cited in contrast to the gradual emergence of a new tradition from the late 1960s onwards, both in Ireland and abroad. History wasn't, to any great degree, understood as being oriented towards culture and social issues. Moreover, a predominant focus on a military struggle against a foreign oppressor was considered as central to the creation of national identity right across Europe. We're not like need facts specialta fún sa As a report by the European Council for Cultural Cooperation conducted in 1973 declared, quote, "Nations are the accidents of history, but after they are born, it is in their historical memory that they find their emotional sustenance, their patriotism. It is a memory most often of a time of struggle, a time when they were united by a common hatred of some alien oppressor, a time to which they later looked back as their heroic age, and the memory of which they keep alive in their history books." This council considered it not only understandable, but necessary that, quote, "Any national system of education must therefore, in its approach to history, be expected to give some prominence to these episodes. If it did not, this sense of national solidarity which gives self-confidence to a people would be weakened," unquote. Ultimately, while certain topics did dominate, as has been noted by others, only a select few events or personalities were universally seen as important across the period, with various aspects of Irish history being of more or less importance depending on the context. And this adds a layer of nuance to an otherwise oversimplified view that Irish history, as I stated, was being portrayed simply as a story of the bad Englishmen versus the good Irishmen. It is important to note that if you look at the different topics that are stressed, however, there is a persistent narrative which emerges. And this framed Irish history as a continued militaristic and social struggle against a foreign oppressor, though the examples chosen with which to represent this narrative differed according to the changing socio-political context. Now, I'll skip, like I said, Leaving Cert was almost the same. There was a bit more of a focus on, say, pre-Norman Gaelic and early Christian Ireland, and there was space within the Leaving Cert to go against to ask questions that differ from the narrative that was promoted in Intracert. But ultimately, the Leaving Certificate allowed for the inclusion of Protestant perspective, but generally framed them within a wider Gaelic narrative. There was also the avoidance of contemporary history in the Leaving Cert exams, as was similar to elsewhere. And I said this avoidance was evident from the 1950s until the 1950s, when more recent topics began to be discussed. But overall, unlike what John O'Callaghan says, the Leaving Cert did not promote a crude form of Catholic nationalism. It did continue, however, to maintain a traditionalist great man approach dominated by a nationalist worldview, which focused predominantly on Gaelic Ireland and the importance of religion. So, counteracting the claims by the Department of Education that history teaching was consistently improved during this period, this final section will briefly highlight a selection of the numerous and serious practical issues which hindered teachers. So it's rud of on if a kind fan syllabus and the takes hours in school. It's a whole other thing than to say, well, what was it actually like as a teacher to teach history at the time? And so teachers worked in a tightly prescribed educational space due to the constraints of the examination, the curriculum, and the general cultural and political ethos. Often factors which affected history teachers were the same as affected teachers in any other subject, be it something like inadequate salaries, inadequate facilities, and then other practical concerns that were facing pedagogy, such as exam pressure of students not attending for the required time. While the inspectorate represented an idealized version of the teacher, the following constraints impinged dramatically on history teaching in secondary schools. And that is the high number of unqualified teachers working at the time, the insufficient provision of school equipment and teaching aids, the overcrowded class sizes, and issues of time allocation, both in terms of how many periods per week history were given, as well as how many years of study students were completing. So it also differed from intermediate and Leaving Cert. In a nutshell, the teachers at intermediate level were more often untrained, unqualified, would focus more on the textbooks and use that to guide their classrooms. Whereas at Leaving Cert, though you had a lot fewer numbers of students who progressed to it, the teachers would generally tend to be better. Which would then show that I suppose the more advanced the learning was becoming, the less reliance there were on the textbooks and the greater importance the teacher would have. And such an evaluation is consistent with the official departmental records of history from the time. It's important, owing to progression rates as well, that we remember, despite it being better at leaving cert, the great majority of secondary schools completed their studies at intermediate level, which meant that the version that they learned up until their intermediate cert was the lasting memory of school history at the time. I won't carry on very much in terms of about the actual teachers themselves, because I know we're running a bit out of time. But I suppose in a nutshell, there was always this issue of remuneration status. It was noted in the Dáil in 1924, the scandalous position in which secondary teachers find themselves in terms of these, where it is criticised how they have practically no tenure. We know that they are wretchedly paid. We know that they do not know in a particular year what their income will be. We know that they have no right to pension. The minister knows that. The president has admitted, and everybody knows it. So is bocht an duine an múinteoir. And this has been the case since early in the 20th century. O'Mcneil mentioned it in 1911. He said, in secondary school, reform and improvement are hopeless so long as the teachers are the orphans of education. Ní fiú an taim a chahabh chun rudí a chur na cheart, muna bhfuil éan airgid caite no éan aum tucad as na múinteoirí chunaí the olivú. And he says, without this time to prepare the secondary teachers, these are the people who will have to lay the foundations of university education. These are the people who have to handle, quote, the best brains of the country at the most critical periods of their development. And this precarious nature of employment was something that which Owen O'Neill was acutely aware of. He said in 1927 that he would improve the status of teachers in the national interest, he said, and restore this high honour and appreciation for the profession of teacher. He said, until we see a radical change in this regard, the material provision for the teaching profession will be of the most grudging basis. McNeill can't be said to have been successful in this endeavour. It was high rhetoric, sounds lovely, didn't happen. But this grudging basis was prevalent across Ireland. Secondary schools, and in the West especially, were, quote, hard-pressed to provide an education to meet increasing demands and changing needs. The material conditions of teachers were a major issue, and alongside issues of security of tenure, constituted, I suppose, the largest issue repeatedly seen in the ACI files. They had their capitation grants were cut by 10% in the 30s. This wasn't restored until 1957 and then up to 1959. So they went about 30 years on a grudging salary that was less than it had been in the 1920s. And this explains why in 1949, the Irish Times were able to run a story of, quote, few graduates want to become teachers. It's not until the late 1960s that you see, I suppose, an increase in this and teacher salaries improved by 12.5% in base salary in 1964. So I will summarize what I was going to say. Tish, on Bruama, Tish, gohfuil fi Bruama ní fiú ormsanish ach fi Bruama leis galtaí iad hain. Fi Bruama na múinteoirí chun school and condultry and course in Umlan muna bhfuil na daltaí tacht. There was a whole issue where compulsory education was introduced in 1926, but you still had a large number of students not completing the 4 years of the course, which caused significant issues. Effectively, so muna bhfuil gut a ghavli and concursa kerabli and avuna. You're forced to cram if you're trying to prepare people in 2 years for a 4-year course. Agus Marigiana blian ghavli and the artist. And such a situation shaped how history teaching was being conducted. Due to time constraints, history was being geared towards schooling rather than education, regardless of the official purpose, in an effort to prepare students for the certificate examinations. As acknowledged by Agnes McMahon, quote, theory can often be divorced from practice. The realities of a particular situation can prevent a teacher from fulfilling his or her original aim. And here we see problems between the pressures of teaching and the overbearing influence of the state examination. It became necessary for the teacher, as stated in 1953, quote, to move quickly along, and it sometimes happens that knowledge gaps are left, and a bias emerges towards using shortcut teaching methods which do not favour teaching or learning. All of these issues reflected an early statement by TCD Professor of Education Robert Finn, who stated how, quote, even when due allowance is made for reforming zeal, missionary enthusiasm, prophetic ecstasy, and apostolic fervour, it must be granted that things are far from well in the realms of education. So, in conclusion, is sampla sléir é cóhéics na héireann so the hockey or the here ir cholínach chur a féinúlach náisiúnta chun cín in Ignas Bacchus Trí de Chóirsa. The Irish context can be seen as a prime example of a post-colonial society promoting its national identity. Political figures, as well as leading educationists, saw the schools as a means through which changes in society could be effected and voiced their opinions often in debate. This paper highlighted the major textbooks used, their authors, the perspective from which they were written. The examination papers demonstrated how certain parts of the syllabi were repeatedly favoured over others. The nature of the Leaving Cert during this period, notably through its more in-depth study of shorter periods, meant that there was less of a consistent narrative than that intermediate certificate, if judged according to the topics approach. Thematically, though, there was a continuation of some of the approaches of the intermediate cert, with emphasis on the great man approach and military and political history. The Leaving Cert, though, maintained a greater overall emphasis on cultural and religious history than previously, especially in relation to pre-Norman, Gaelic, and early Christian Ireland. Considering the low progression rates, however, the intermediate certificate provided the dominant official narrative of Irish history transmitted to students in secondary schools between 1924 and 1969. And this narrative, as expressed through the exams, used the Norman invasion as a foundational episode from which all that came after stemmed. The focus was on central events giving prominence to a narrative of oppression and resistance, such as the Confederation of Kilkenny, the War of O'Neill and O'Donnell, and the United Irishmen, and the 1798 rebellion. This featured an overwhelming dominance of male historical figures. There was also an awareness during this period that, as written here, that while few subjects were as interesting as history, usually teachers weren't able to teach it as they wished. So no matter how Rochin saw, is biogáver a glár is samúla ag nadaltaí ná ag an múntóir ná an stair, ac I bhúna gart. Agus miste adháil gur minic nach fristan múntóir an stair a bhúna mar ba bhíon leis agus nám cíanna nadaltaí olbhú mar is cuí don scrúdacháin. As lamented by one influential ASTI delegate in 1964, and which could equally apply to a modern day setting, quote, by our silence, the association was condoning what was becoming an examination-ridden country. We should make clear that we are not educating for exams only, but that secondary education was a full 6-year course at any rate. And this has some very real ramifications. It demonstrates the considerable divide between rhetoric and reality in educational practice. If governments are to stress the importance of history, both in terms of allowing for an appreciation of a nation's culture and identity, and towards developing skills of empathy and criticality, then there also needs to be a corresponding increase in subject status, in time allocation, and support. This gulf between purpose and practice in relation to the teaching of Irish history was crucial. It shows how the success of any official programme is dependent on the ability to provide subjects with appropriate resources, structures, and favourable conditions. In order to make reasoned decisions as to subjects' value and merit, it is necessary to come from an informed position. This paper, by showing a taste of what has gone before, provides some very real practical benefits to those attempting to understand the position of Irish history in secondary education and its future. As argued by David Canaline in his own work in history teaching in England, and is equally applicable to debates in Ireland over reforms of the Junior Cert History programme and the removal of the subject's mandatory status, quote, no government should try to reform history teaching in schools without some awareness of what has gone before and of how things got to be the way they now are. Right,
thanks very much, Colm.
Wow, and Habron and Chus Alvrin Harrison and I hope you stayed with me. So thank you for that, and apologies for going a little bit over.
No problem. I suppose we had one question there, which was to what extent were Dev and Collins taught, if at all? So I kind of maybe broaden that out slightly to ask you to what extent, how did they deal with when they eventually start doing things like 1916? How do they deal with, in your time period, the fact that some of these people are still alive and still in power? So kind of a two-part question there.
In a nutshell, Dev and Collins aren't taught in schools. Outside of individual teachers might have made the decision to have lessons on it, but in terms of what was officially being set in the curriculum, what was being asked in the exams, what is being in the textbooks, even very little mention of the two, because that was seen as it kind of differed in terms of what history was supposed to be. It was supposed to be something beforehand, as opposed to be present politics. But as I mentioned, that fitted into when they did try to bring in more recent history in 1941, for example. And there was this whole debate between 41 and 43. This, as I said, that term, that black curtain of avoidance was very, very evident in terms of what was being taught. It was seen that if you start focusing too much on contemporary history, you're bridging into modern day politics, and that was just seen to cause trouble. You do, however, get a new series of textbooks come in from the late 60s. They were the Gill and Macmillan texts, and they were famous, I suppose, not just in terms of the modern period, but just in general. What they did was they brought in the use of primary sources. They brought in a more, I suppose, a reasonable approach. There was also this a very awareness in these textbooks that this is a textbook and that it's open to interpretation, and so that would allow a bit of leeway when they're starting to discuss more modern periods, because it was acknowledging, I suppose, the positionality of the textbook writer.
That's great. Another question in relation to this would be, how do they deal with the problem of the border? I mean, I noticed in your list of questions there, they had a lot of questions about kind of what might be, to some degree, the genesis of the border. So there were a lot of questions on the Ulster plantation and the 9 Years' War, and particularly as kind of two standout events in a long history. Say the not to rile your Munsterness up or anything, but the focus on the 9 Years' War and comparison to, say, the Desmond Rebellion is probably interesting in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And especially in the first, say, 20 years of the new state, there was, I suppose, an attempt to, well, I would see it as an attempt to legitimize, the claims for Ulster still by focusing on, by using school history to show the Ulster plantations were very, very bad, weren't they? You do have questions, for example, in 1931, and I skipped this during the debate, but when they talk about themes of land, occupation, and oppression, and there was a question in 1931 that said, the English policy in Ireland from the Tudors to William III was a policy that aimed at depriving the Irish people of their lands. Explain and illustrate this statement. And I suppose what statements like this would do is it would connect being Irish with being the deprived Catholics in the wake of plantation, and they're inherently political. But you continue that on, it'd be, if they're stressing how the initial plantations were unjustified or were illegal, were seen as bad, then by proxy you're stating that the border shouldn't be there. But they don't engage directly with the issue of partition. It's not on the course. So it's more, you can read between the lines and say that that a certain mentality towards Ulster is being promoted, but there is no direct engagement with partition. It is mentioned. I think there might be a line at the end of Carthy's textbooks, and that's about it. And also, and similarly at the end of O'Shuckru's text, like a very short line or two where they say, "Well, we won't get into this too much."
Yeah, and you were talking there about the differences between Catholic schools and Protestant schools, and there's not as much difference as we might expect, etc. I was just wondering, just when you're researching, did you come across any, when you see, if you're talking about correspondence or people's memories, even just when you're giving talks like this and people come and talk to you, do you notice any kind of urban-rural divide or class divides in how people remember things being taught, or did you notice anything like that?
I have, yeah. And I suppose I kind of mentioned it in say my research in terms of who is using the specific textbooks. So we can tell that so Micheál Shukru, Star Ceannacha Saoirinn, that is the textbook for the Christian Brothers, and that had a more nationalistic, I suppose, bent to it in terms of how the narrative is portrayed. But then when you look at, say, the majority of Protestant schools with Cassidy's book, it's a bit milder, shall we say. Hayden and Moonan's book as well, it's more focused on constitutional nationalism, promoting a Gaelic form of Irish, but not a Republican example. And so when you would find that, like, well, where Christian Brothers are, I suppose, where you would think of where the Jesuit schools, were they using Star Catholics there? No, it doesn't appear that's the case. And so from that, then, based on, I suppose, the class of who's being taught, who which order are in charge of the schools, they would then focus on which type of textbook would be used in there, and by proxy then which kind of perspective through which the national story is being read by the students and being promoted by the teachers. But yeah, I think, I mean, like, because there's so many different types of schools in Ireland, and they're stretched across. The general thing would be that most secondary schools use Carty's textbook it was a lot cheaper. It only cost like a shilling, I think it was, in comparison to like 12, which Mooning had. But the majority of schools are going to be using Carty's textbook, and only those who could afford the likes of Hayden were using it, because it was expensive, which just meant that most schools followed kind of a similar textual narrative. At least how that's interpreted by the teachers is different then.
That's interesting. Yeah, and the teacher's interpretation is probably something. I mean, I've two aspects maybe of the teacher's interpretation, which I'll ask you to comment on, and they're two ones. Was really, yeah, you're talking about the state kind of trying to justify itself. Is there any evidence of pushback on that from teachers or even students, or students pushing back on teachers? And the other side of that might be a similar question about maybe values or views, or how views impacted. Is there any impact? Can you see? Do you come across any testimony or anything about the impact of people's views on grading? So if someone was to say something like, someone was to kind of reject the dominant nationalist version, would and put it down in an exam, do you ever see anything of guidance about people being, examiners been told to mark that down, or do you hear any memories from students remembering that they felt they'd been marked down, or do you ever come across anything like that?
I have not, in terms of, say, the 26 counties. I have seen examples written about Northern Ireland, and Seamus Dean, for example, wrote in a study that was published in Trinity in the 1980s called Arts and Education by Daniel Murphy, and he said how he sat the A levels, for example, 3 times, and the first time he did it on English history, and he did well enough. The second time he did it on Irish history, and they said he got a quarter of the mark. So that's I suppose it's an anecdotal example of that. In terms of say the Republic, or the Free State and the Republic, it's very difficult to get at information like that for a number of reasons. One, the Department of Education they don't open their archives to researchers unless they're not in the National Archives, shall we say, which makes it very difficult to look at something like inspector records for secondary schools. You can get records for the primary schools, but they're not exams. There was also the issue where the teachers themselves advocated not to be told what was being expected in the exam. They didn't want to get the inspected notes. You do see in actually, this is probably the best example of what you're getting at there. You do see some teacher pushback to exams, not to individual answers being given, but to the questions that were being set. And the ASTI have, in their internal records, they would have a committee at each year would meet in the summer to discuss the exam that had been set, whether or not they considered it appropriate or not, and also there would be campaigning against who was setting exams. So, for example, from the 40s onwards, especially, a lot of the secondary school exams were being set by university professors, and the ASTI were saying, well, that's analogous to me setting a primary school exams that I've never taught in a primary school. Why should I be the one who's allowed to set an exam for it? And so there was a whole issue of who was setting the exam. And in the SDI files, you do see some teacher pushback specifically against that. But in terms of pushback, in terms of individual answers, I have no way of knowing that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks. I'm just gonna minimize you here just so I can see some more comments from the people. I think we lost it there, so I think we'll leave it there. Thanks everybody.